Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Jim Murphy from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Regional Office in Boston. I wanted to welcome you all here tonight, a night we've been waiting for quite a while. As I think most people in the room probably know, is that we did extend the public comment period on our proposal through October 27th, so there's plenty of time still to get your comments in after tonight. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to give folks an opportunity to submit their comments orally. We also, if there's people who would like to submit any statements, you're certainly free to do that also tonight. The way we're going to do it is Dean Tagliaferro, who's our project manager, is just going to do a brief synopsis of what the proposal, EPA's proposal is. We're not going to be taking questions. Following Dean's presentation, we're just going to ask people to come up to the two microphones we have. You can line up however you're comfortable doing it. We didn't have a sign-in sheet. Line up and make your comments, where what we're asking is that people try not to take more than 5 minutes until everybody else, to give other folks a chance to offer any comments. After that, if people want to come up again, they're certainly welcome to do that. I just wanted to note that we, Tricia Farley-Bovier, the state rep for Pittsfield, is here tonight, wherever she is, and Dan Johnson from Congressman Neal's office is also here. I think Dan's in the back. So without a further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Dean. But I just want to remind folks that we're not going to be answering questions. When the meeting is over, when the hearing is over, we'll be around for a while if people want to come up and discuss any points. And also, when you come up to the microphone, if you could just state your name and the town you're from, just so we have that for the record. We do have a stenographer. If he doesn't, he may ask occasionally for you to spell your name or something if he so desires to ask. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Dean. Thanks.
Yep. Good evening. Thanks for coming out on such a nice night. And as Jim said, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what you're commenting on, or what we're looking for comments on. I'm sure most of you already know that, but just to summarize some of the key issues. So out front, there's two key documents that EPA put out in early June. The draft modification to the permit, that is what's proposed to be the remedy that GE would have to follow. So that's the actual draft of what would be a binding permit. And the rationale that supports that draft permit is called the Statement of Basis. So those are the two key documents that we're looking for comments on. And they're both available out front and on our webpage. So the proposed plan covers what we call the rest of the river, which starts at the confluence of the east and west branches in Pittsfield, Mass., and goes down to Derby Dam in Connecticut. So that's the extent of the project. Some of the blow-up of what we call Reach 5 is the 10.5 miles from the confluence to Woods Pond. And it's the first 5 miles are in Pittsfield, that's 5A. 5B is the next 2 miles. That goes from just north of New Lenox Road to a little bit south of New Lenox Road, and then 5C runs from south of New Lenox Road down to the headwaters of Woods Pond. So I'll be using those terms, so that's one of the reasons I'm pointing that out. So let me skip one there. So the components of the remediation, we've broken them down into the river sediment and banks. That's one distinct unit. Impoundments or dams with the water that's backed up behind it that has separate cleanup requirements. And then the backwaters and floodplains adjacent to the river. So again, in Reach 5, for riverbed sediment, the proposed plan calls for Total sediment removal in reaches 5A and 5C, so bank to bank, sufficient enough to put an engineered cap in. And in 5B, that stretch just north and south of New Lenox Road, it requires only the removal of sediment with PCBs greater than 50 parts per million. And the banks are treated separately as well. In Reach 5A, in areas where sampling shows contaminated riverbanks that are also subject to erosion or are likely to erode. So the erodible contaminated riverbanks will require removal in 5A in Pittsfield. And then in 5B, any areas of riverbanks with concentrations of PCBs greater than 50 parts per million are targeted for removal. And the other key point is the restoration in these riverbanks. There's a strong preference for soft engineering or bioengineering as opposed to riprap or armor or concrete. So then the first major impoundment, Woods Pond, which is 10.5 miles south of the confluence. The remedy is sediment removal and capping of the entire pond, which will result in a deepening of the pond to a minimum of 6-foot depth, with obviously some sloping from the bottom of the pond to the nearshore areas. So the entire pond will be capped. Downstream of Woods Pond, there's another 5 impoundments in Massachusetts. And the remedy calls for, to the extent practical, if someone's going to propose dam removal, to have this facilitate the dam removal, removing sediment down to 1 part per million PCBs that will allow that to happen. If there is no dam removal by the time the remedies get implemented in those reaches, then the remedy is to excavate and cap over areas exceeding 1 part per million. And there's also provisions called institutional controls that will address any contamination remaining behind the dams to allow for dam maintenance to be handled properly, or if in the future an entity wants to remove a dam, requirements will still be maintained and GE will be obligated to comply with them. So another key area are the areas adjacent to the river, the floodplains, which include backwaters, floodplains, and vernal pools. First one I'll talk about is the backwaters, areas that tend to pond up. Similar to the impoundments, areas with PCBs greater than 1 part per million will be excavated and capped. And again, the excavation depth is only as much as necessary to allow for an engineered cap to be placed back in. There is an exception, and this will apply to all the floodplain work, in areas called core areas, which are areas designated by Massachusetts Fish and Game that have a high species richness or other environmentally sensitive issues for sensitive species or natural communities. In those areas, there's a requirement to excavate and cap only in areas greater than 50 parts per million. So there'll be less work in these environmentally sensitive areas. However, in the areas between 1 and 50 parts per million, there'll be some innovative technology proposed and looked at that's less invasive. The floodplains is a fairly complicated situation. We've basically broken the floodplain adjacent to the river into 90 separate areas called exposure areas. And each one of those areas has a area-specific cleanup standard. They have a primary and a secondary standard. So if the concentration of PCBs exceeds that standard, then remediation is required. So in areas where there's no core areas or sensitive ecological areas, the requirement is for GE to meet the primary or more stringent cleanup number. Again, in areas, in these core areas, there's requirements for avoid and minimization of the work in the core areas, primarily core area 1. However, under all circumstances, GE will be required to meet the secondary and still protective cleanup number. And for the vast majority of the floodplain, the removal will be 1 foot of floodplain soil excavated and then replaced with clean material. However, in a few select frequently used or high use areas, the requirement is for 3 feet of excavation and 3 feet of backfill. The other separate category identified in the draft permit is vernal pools. And the general requirement is to remediate down to 3 parts per million PCB. So vernal pools that have current concentrations that exceed that are targeted for remediation. However, it's more of an iterative approach in the vernal pools with seeing how the first set of pools go, which will dictate how the process plays out. And there's a requirement for the use of innovative technologies for a less destructive approach or a less invasive approach in some of these vernal pools. And again, a key factor as to which vernal pools get remediated is, are they inside or outside a sensitive core area? So there's still several other sections of the river that did not have areas specified for excavation or capping. These are the reaches south of Woods Pond in between the impoundments, and also what we call reaches 9 through 16. Reach 9 is downstream of Rising Pond, but still in Massachusetts, and 10 through 16 is Connecticut. So the remedy calls for monitored natural recovery in those areas, which means no active remediation, but it will have a lot of long-term monitoring and some, again, institutional controls for residual PCB contamination. The main benefit to these areas is likely to come from some of the upstream remediation. So that will have an effect on these stretches of the river, even though there's no active remediation in Connecticut, for example. So all of the material that gets excavated or dredged out of the river or floodplain, the proposed plan has that material to be transported to an off-site licensed disposal facility. And there's a preference to use rail infrastructure where feasible to limit the amount of truck traffic on local roads. So those are the main components in the permit. But the permit also has a lot of other requirements that need to be complied with. One of them is a general performance standard for fish tissue concentrations and how much PCBs will still be allowed to flow over the dams. So those are called 2 general performance standards that need to be complied with. There are provisions for adaptive management and consideration of new and innovative technologies. So the intent is not to have a rigid permit and to get locked into very specific methods. As we mentioned, a key component is long-term operation, monitoring, and maintenance. 5-year reviews are done to ensure that the remedy is protective going forward, to look at new information and make sure it remains a protective remedy. So the permit describes what GE has to do, what they have to achieve. It doesn't dictate how they have to do it. So that's going to come after the permit's issued through a series of plans that GE submits to the agencies, that the agencies will review and approve. And the agencies will make those available to the public and provide opportunity for towns and cities and the public to also weigh in on those plans. Some of the key ones are a quality of life compliance plan, which will set air quality standards, for example. How is GE going to measure the air quality in the area? What roads are they proposing to use? And what are some of the community health and safety issues? So that's going to come after the permit's issued. And a lot of these are a few more requirements that are in there, and a lot of the actual footprint or remediation will be determined in the future based on additional data collection. And after the data collection's done, then the final remediation maps can be developed, submitted, and for agency review and approval. And that is when GE will propose the methods to implement the remediation, identify the staging areas, and identify the local roads. And then obviously they'll have a schedule associated with that when the work will happen. So this was our estimate, or EPA's estimate, of the anticipated schedule. And as you can see, it takes about 13 years. That's what's anticipated now. And that 13 years starts after the permit becomes final, after all the appeals are heard, and once a final decision is made on a remedy. That would be when GE can start doing some of those planning documents. So even after a remedy is decided, it'll still be probably 1 or 2 years before active remediation gets going. So it'll probably be 3 to 5 years from today, hopefully, when GE starts the remediation. So you can see it starts up in Reach 5A in Pittsfield and generally progresses downstream. So this is just an attempt to summarize some of the big components of the remedy. As you can see, it requires excavation in 45 acres of the floodplain, significant amount of excavation and capping in the riverbed and backwaters, about 300 acres. Roughly 1 million cubic yards of material is currently targeted to be removed. And we anticipate that will result in an approximate 90% reduction of the flow of PCBs over Woods Pond Dam and over Rising Pond Dam. So again, a big impact on areas downstream and into Connecticut. As I mentioned, the requirement is for GE to take the material off-site and transport it to a licensed hazardous waste landfill. The estimated cost is over $600 million and roughly about 13 years to implement once the remediation gets started. So the purpose of this meeting, or public hearing, is to get your comments on the record. This is one of the ways to get your comments on the record that EPA will respond to. The other way is the comment period goes through October 27th. There's an email address or a mailing address for where the comments can be sent. They are on the statement of basis document, which is out front, and also on our webpage. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk more about the hearing.
So I'm going to read a statement into the record here that'll kick off our hearing, and then we'll turn the floor over to you all. Good evening. My name is Bob Cianciarulo, the EPA Region 1 office in Boston. We're here tonight for the public hearing regarding the draft modification to the reissued RCRA permit for the General Electric Company facility in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I will be the presiding officer for this hearing, and this hearing will now come to order. RCRA, or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, is a federal law addressing hazardous and solid waste. In 1991, EPA issued GE a permit for corrective action regarding releases of hazardous waste, including PCBs, at GE's Pittsfield facility. That corrective action permit has been modified or reissued several times since 1994. The reissued RCRA permit is part of a larger consent decree under which GE is required, among other things, to complete investigation and remediation of different areas of contamination in Pittsfield and in 3 segments of the Housatonic River. The hearing tonight is with respect to the rest of river segment of the Housatonic River. This rest of river is from the confluence of the east and west branches of the river in Pittsfield, just below Fred Garner Park, flowing through Massachusetts and Connecticut for roughly 125 miles. Under the decree and the reissued RCRA permit, GE has been required to perform certain investigation and analysis of the rest of river. Based on the administrative record file, which includes the information submitted by GE as well as other information, EPA has proposed a remedial action for the rest of river. That proposal is in the draft permit modification and statement of basis issued in June 2014. EPA held information sessions here in Lenox on June 18, 2014, and in Kent, Connecticut on June 24, 2014. The formal public comment period for the draft permit modification began on June 25, 2014, and is scheduled to end on October 27, 2014. Following the closure of the comment period, EPA will review and consider all comments received during the public comment period, both in writing and provided verbally at this hearing. Under the decree, the next steps are as follows. EPA is to notify GE of EPA's intended final decision on the permit modification, after which GE has the opportunity to dispute EPA's intended final decision. After completion of the dispute resolution period, or if GE does not invoke dispute resolution after 30 days from EPA's notification to GE, EPA is to issue a final modification of the reissued RCRA permit. That final permit, unless appealed, will obligate GE to perform EPA-selected cleanup. At this hearing, any person may submit oral or written statements and data concerning the draft permit modification. EPA will not be responding formally tonight to oral or written statements. When EPA issues a final permit modification decisions, EPA will issue a response to comments. The hearing is being transcribed by EPA to ensure all comments are received. The hearing is also being taped and recorded. In addition to making comments tonight, you may also provide written comments to EPA during the public comment period. To help make this hearing run smoothly, I would ask that anyone who likes to make a statement come to the microphone. We've set up on either side of the stage here. Before you begin your statement, please identify yourself and, for the aid of our stenographer, spell your name and provide your affiliation for the record. There are a lot of people here tonight. To ensure that everyone has the opportunity to express their views, I ask that you limit your comments to 5 minutes. At any time, if you're asked to stop, but you have not completed your comments, I'll ask that you defer the remainder of your comments until each person has had an initial opportunity to comment. If there's time at the end of the evening, we'll give you an opportunity to finish those comments. If you have a written statement, you may read it if it can be done in 5 minutes. If not, I'd ask you to summarize those comments and submit the written comments for the record. In either case, I encourage you to submit the written statement tonight or before the close of the close of the public comment period. With that, I'll invite anyone wishing to make a comment to step to the microphones, and we'll begin the hearing.
My name is Peter DeFur. I live in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia. My last name is D-E, capital F-U-R. I'm a consultant, environmental stewardship concepts. I work under a technical assistance grant from EPA to the Housatonic River Initiative, for whom I work. I'm here to provide comments on the draft permit and basis. Basically, they are inadequate to protect public health and the environment, ecological receptors. They do not remove enough of the PCB mass or the contaminated sediment from the river system, the floodplains, vernal pools, or any of the associated areas. The result is that for the foreseeable future, if not in perpetuity, the region will be contaminated with PCBs. The problem will be that low-level PCBs will continue to poison wildlife, they will continue to poison the river, they will continue to be transported downriver, accumulate in sediments, accumulate in wildlife. We know from extensive research on human health and ecological systems that PCBs are incredibly toxic at low levels. Every year we learn new dangers from PCBs. Just last year, the World Health Organization determined that PCBs are a known human carcinogen. Continued research in the peer-reviewed literature indicates that community members surrounding PCB-contaminated sites have elevated concentrations of PCBs in their bodies. The entire community around the Housatonic River is likely exposed to PCBs at levels that are causing biological responses, including depressed immune systems, learning disabilities in children, and abnormal development of the fetus. Wildlife studies come out anew every month, indicating that low levels of PCBs interfere not only with fish reproduction, amphibian reproduction, bird reproduction, but also with bird behavior and bird songs. And that these are not limited to vertebrates, that the soil invertebrates, the insects, the worms, and the minute crustaceans that live not only in the river but also in the soils are subject to the same adverse effects. All of these combine to make it more imperative that the draft permit and basis be modified to remove a much greater mass of PCBs from the system. One of the consequences is going to be, if the permit is implemented as written, that there will be a great amount of hardscape, that is fixed channel river. That fixed channel river is simply not practical under the current scenario of weather changes and the known increase in severe weather that's going to occur in this system as well as others. We've already seen it, and it's only going to get worse, which means that the river's normal meander is going to meander even more in the coming years, which will make any hard fix, any hard remediation, such as bunkering and riprap, it's going to be impermanent, even if we think it's going to be permanent. Restoration, ecology, and restoration methods have advanced many-fold in the last 10 or 15 years. The Housatonic River in this region is ripe for using the newest techniques for restoration. It is also ripe for using the most recent and modern methods in remediation, that is for removal. Not large-scale, bulk, steam shovel type removal of sediments, but pinpointed hydraulic removal with piping down to centrally located processing areas, where in some cases we can even pilot new modern techniques for PCB detoxification, dechlorination, and elimination. In closing, I want to point out also that other sites are using plant banks to extract the plants that are in a place that needs to be remediated and culturing those elsewhere for use when the restoration occurs. We recognize that what's going to happen here if this plan is implemented as written is that humans will continue to be exposed at excess levels, wildlife will continue to be exposed at excess levels, all sorts of invertebrates and even microbes will be exposed at levels that are known to cause effects. Nobody knows how those effects alter the entire ecosystem. I'll be submitting written comments for the record on behalf of HRI. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you.
My name is Joseph Larson, L-A-R-S-O-N. I'm a emeritus professor of environmental conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Tonight I'm speaking for the Massachusetts Fisheries and Wildlife Board, on which I'm a member. The Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, which is supervised by our board, is the largest landowner in the affected area of the Housatonic. The land and wetlands in our care were acquired by gift or purchased from donors and funds with the expectation, backed by our pledge, is that these areas would be preserved in perpetuity for their natural and recreational values. The area is officially recognized by the state and other authorities for its unique and rich natural resources. It's also an area that's highly valued for outdoor recreation by residents of Massachusetts, and it annually attracts people from across the state and from other states in the nation. Our board recognizes that the PCB contamination poses a public health risk that must be addressed. We have provided extensive assistance to EPA in the form of division staff time, field studies, and scientific analyses. We are also aware that there is no silver bullet solution that applies to every area that's contaminated with PCBs. Each area in the nation where PCB contamination exists has required development of a unique approach that cannot be simply copied for any other contaminated area. This plan, including mass removal of PCBs from Woods Pond, presented by EPA, has been crafted to responsibly address the public health risks, while at the same time responsibly maintaining as much as possible the natural and recreational values of this section of the Housatonic. It has been a difficult balancing act, but it is a Housatonic plan, and it has our full support.
Thank you.
My name is Becky Cushing, C-U-S-H-I-N-G. I'm the Sanctuary Director for Mass Audubon's Berkshire Wildlife Sanctuaries. Mass Audubon has been closely engaged in the planning process for the cleanup of PCBs from the Housatonic for many years. The following comments are preliminary and provide an overview of our key points from our perspective. We will be developing more detailed written comments during the extended comment period, and we appreciate the additional time provided for comment. This remediation planning process has taken decades, and the cleanup is projected to take more than another decade to complete once approved. This is unfortunate, yet not unexpected, as remediation of such extensive contamination of the environment with persistent insidious toxic substances must proceed with appropriate care and deliberation. It is also vitally important that the remediation plans provide the opportunity to learn from experience as cleanup phases proceed, include flexibility to incorporate improved science and methods as they become available, and address the inherently dynamic nature of river systems. Mass Audubon is both a directly impacted landowner at our Canoe Meadows Wildlife Sanctuary and has a broader interest in the conservation and restoration of the Housatonic River ecosystem for the benefit of both people and wildlife. Our property is located at the head of the rest of the river, where the methods for the cleanup will first be applied, and this property contains habitat for numerous rare and common species of plants and animals. We are encouraged in several respects by the statement of basis and draft permit, in that they explicitly address several of our previous key comments. Notably, the concepts of project phasing and adaptive management have been incorporated. The conceptual cleanup plan also recognizes the sensitivity of the natural ecosystems located within the project area and calls for higher levels of protection for some of the most sensitive features, such as endangered plants. Despite this progress, however, the documents fall short of providing a clear plan for the proposed work, nor do they address critically important factors that will affect the integrity and effectiveness of the remediation over the long term. Riverine systems, such as the Housatonic, are inherently unstable and dynamic. The documents attribute much of the instability of current eroding banks to historic land uses that disrupted flow regimes, and predicts that the system will reach dynamic equilibrium in the near future. This ignores the fact that rivers, by their very nature, move and shift in the landscape over time, and that climate change is leading to more intense and extreme storm events that increase the likelihood of catastrophic floods. Leaving significant amounts of PCBs within floodplains in the most ecologically sensitive areas may be appropriate for the short term as a first phase of cleanup. It is not, however, wise in the long-term context given the persistence and toxicity of these chemicals. The plan should be revised to provide for future additional remediation, incorporating more extensive application of adaptive management principles and development of more refined ecological restoration methods. The final plan also needs to include plans for response to extreme catastrophic flood events that disrupt large areas of riverbank, bottom sediments, and floodplain. The statement of basis and draft permit do not, in fact, constitute a comprehensive cleanup plan. Rather, they outline a conceptual approach. Additional information is required as stated in the draft permit, including further sampling as well as the work plan, schedule, and sequencing of work, access points, material and equipment stockpiling locations and haul roads, community health and safety plans, restoration plan, adaptive management plan, dam operation and maintenance plan, invasive species control plan, institutional control plan, and plan for further response actions. The draft permit calls for General Electric to submit all of these documents to EPA for review and approval, but there is no formal opportunity for affected landowners or the public to review and comment on these vitally important details before they are finalized and implemented. Mass Audubon calls on GE and EPA to provide for further opportunity for input, particularly from affected landowners, the surrounding and downstream communities, and other stakeholders, such as people who have an interest in recreational uses of the river. Thank you for considering these comments.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Valerie Anderson, Andersen. I live in Pittsfield. I favor a robust cleanup of the Housatonic River. The EPA plan is good in some respects. The phased plan, I think, is good in that no one town will have the work done for the whole project time. For example, in Pittsfield, the work would only take 5 years, which is less than the amount of time it took to remediate the first 3 miles in Pittsfield. So it would be cleaned up within a 5-year time period in Pittsfield. Another good thing about the plan is that it does call for some adaptive technologies. However, where the plan falls short is that it would leave what's known as core areas contaminated up to 49 parts per million. Now, people probably don't realize it, but if there's 50 parts per million, that's the highest level toxic landfill standard, called a TSCA landfill. 50 parts per million is a TSCA landfill, a toxic waste dump. And your plan is allowing up to 49 parts per million, so just 1 little part per million less. So in effect, it's like the plan is allowing all these little toxic waste dumps in the core areas to be left there. And the rationale is for a guise of sustaining habitats, but it makes no sense to sustain a polluted habitat. So we're going to have all these little toxic waste dumps left there, up to 49 parts per million, when 50 would be a highly regulated toxic landfill. There's many of us in this community who have been affected by cancer in our families, weird blood diseases, multiple sclerosis. PCBs are a really toxic poison that should be cleaned up, and we should not let there to be pockets of little toxic landfills in the rest of the river. We have a responsible party, General Electric, one of the richest corporations in the world, who has the resources to do a cleanup of this area. We should do it now. We should not wait. We should not do a half-baked cleanup right now, because in the future, you might have to come back, and those people who worry about disrupting neighborhoods and tourist attractions and things like that, it's not going to be any good for the tourists or the neighbors if you have to come back and do it all over again. So in conclusion, I do favor a robust cleanup. I think that the plan proposed does not go far enough, especially allowing 49 parts per million to be left in the river. Thank you.
Thank you. It should work, yes. You stood up first, so we're gonna.
I'm not sure how to take that.
My name's Dennis Regan, R-E-G-A-N, and I'm representing the Housatonic Valley Association, and I don't think I need to spell Housatonic, I don't, do I? I'd like to thank you as well for the opportunity to provide comments on the draft remediation plan. However, we would like to state that we feel that the current proposal does not go far enough to protect the health of the river, of wildlife, and of human health. The proposal leaves behind 75% of the PCBs, which to us does not seem like a very good remediation plan. It leaves far too many PCBs behind in either the floodplain, the river bottom, or under the sand rug. HPA will submit a written comment that goes into more detail on these issues, but for right now, for this presentation, I'll just hit some of the main areas, or our main concerns. Primarily, it's leaving the core habitat areas contaminated. These areas of rare and endangered species, we're very fortunate we have so many in such a unique area in the wildlife refuge in that area, the rest of the river. But they're contaminated, their habitat's contaminated, and they will stay contaminated until we do something about it. So logically, it doesn't make any sense at all to me. EPA has also proven that they can restore a rare endangered species of area such as they did in the vernal pools in Pittsfield, where they remove the species, clean up the contaminated sites, and then replace the species and let Mother Nature take its course. And that has proven effective, and I think they can do the same thing again here. Another main concern we have is the high degree of sand capping. And again, we feel that capping is basically sweeping the PCBs under a sand rug. It may look good for now, but we have serious doubts that it can withstand the test of time, especially in an active, dynamic river system. We feel that there's too much reliance on the use of capping and would rather see actual removal of the contaminated soil. Another area of concern is the high parts per million that's considered safe for our area, and it's 49 or 50 parts per million, which is being proposed in that area. And when we just were going through the PCB remediation in Pittsfield, we had 2, 10, or 25% that were considered the so-called safe levels. Well, now we're thinking of 49% is safe. If we hit 49% up in Pittsfield, that would have been considered a hot spot, not a safe area. So there's some irregularities there, I think. However, there are some positive points in the remediation plan as it stands right now. We're very much in favor of the no on-site landfills. We're very much in favor of the sediment removal behind the dams. And we appreciate the concern over the removal of the contaminated soil, be it by the two main areas, be road or railway. And we appreciate the railroad alternative, although it's still going to need a lot of discussions and negotiations and technology trying to figure out how to do that best. And remedial technology investigation, the ongoing investigation of, as Susan so accurately placed, as some pixie dust that will solve the problem. We're still hoping for that. And continued monitoring is essential, and we're happy to see that is still part of the plan. But again, we feel that the more contaminated soils need to be removed from the river and floodplain. We have an opportunity to remediate now, and we should take advantage of this opportunity rather than lose it for all time. We do understand the valid concerns regarding the negative impacts related to this remediation process. We realize that there will be a cost for restoring the river. I wish that we didn't have to dig up the river in the floodplain, but since PCBs cause serious harm to wildlife and humans, we feel that we need to remove this threat. Therefore, we feel the short-term disturbances are worth the long-term security of a healthy environment for us and for future generations. We unfortunately have a river that qualifies as a Superfund site. The Environmental Protection Agency's job is to protect the environment and human health. And I know that you want to do the right thing, so please, this is the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jeffrey Cook. I live at 9 Palomino Drive. I'm one of the coordinators of a group called the Ward 4 River Watch about 400 families who are located on both sides of the river and very concerned about the impact of the cleanup on our neighborhood. We're also concerned about the impact of the cleanup on the wildlife areas, and once again raise the question of how we get to these standards. I've heard tonight about some additional scientific information, which I think we ought to have a standard that when people say those things, they ought to submit the reports, because we have more than once had a situation where the study itself says we can't show causality, we can show associations. It's a huge difference. And then people come up to the mic and say it causes this and it causes that. Here's some things that the Department of Public Health has determined. That in the Allendale area, the Allendale School, around the river, blood tests have been made. There's no elevated levels of PCBs among the population. There's no detectable levels of PCBs in the air above the floodplains and the river. But we know that's going to change, because we're going to have 13 years of digging this up. And so for some of these neighborhoods, we'll have 5 years of this stuff in the air, where right now it's not there. I have to say that I have participated in this process for years, and I've basically lost confidence in the EPA process. And it bothers me because I like a lot of you. I think this is a very cynical process. We're now having hearings and comment periods on what the cleanup's going to be. But of course, we're leaving out things like access roads and staging areas, which are going to have a huge impact on the areas, the floodplains, the river. And it makes a huge difference. If we had a vacuum cleaner in the sky and we could suck out all the PCBs, that would be cool. That would be great. But that's not what's going to happen. And when you say to us, oh, look, we're going to pump the PCBs downriver, and don't mention that every cubic yard that gets removed is going to be replaced with clean fill, is that going to be pumped up? So there are going to be access roads, and there are going to be staging areas where the material is dewatered and move from one container to another, where there's heavy equipment stored that starts at 6 and 7 in the morning. There are only so many places that these things can be, and you know that. And you know the likely places. So when we raise the question and you tell us, no, we're not sure, it's very disturbing. It's very disturbing. Let's talk about rail. We're talking about 10,000 truckloads a year, 4 trucks an hour. Where is the rail depot going to be to handle that material? You make it sound as if the roads around the neighborhoods and the river are not going to be taxed, because somehow the material gets to the rail. It's a monster to have that kind of a rail operation. Where's that going to be? We should be comfortable, though, because we're going to talk about rail. The other thing that we talk about is new techniques. There's no likelihood that this stuff can be treated today, what we know, and the levels we're talking about in situ. We talk about it, and I have to compliment Tim Gray, because I think he's worked harder than anybody on looking for alternatives. And he's, over the years, named a few, and nothing has come to fore. So we can talk about these things, but I think you know, I think you EPA know, that we're going to have to excavate the river bank to bank until we get down to New Lenox Road. You know there's going to be access roads. You know there's going to be staging areas. And some of the alternatives that are being suggested do not solve the problem of putting back in a cubic yard of material for every cubic yard of material that's removed. So this is all post-permit. And that's where there's huge impact on the environment and on the neighborhoods. So we're going to hear that we had a process, we had public hearings, we got input, and we know that this is the remedy. Except the remedy gets delivered a certain way, and that's not being discussed now. So for those of us who look at this in the neighborhoods that will live with this for 5 years and say, what is happening to us, and that's post-permit, and what's going to happen to these special Core 1 areas where the river bends back and you're somehow going to have the equipment in there to excavate the river bank to bank, but yet in the core areas you're going to be able to do precise digging, and that's supposed to work, and that's not going to involve staging areas and access roads. It's very disappointing. I think we're doing this sideways, and it's more of a political than a community process, and we really just don't see how, in terms of the things that we feel we should be able to know about and comment about, you issue a permit, and the impact hasn't even been talked about so far as we're concerned. So we're very discouraged.
Thank you.
My name is Eric Federer. That's F like in Frank, E-D-E-R-E-R, Eric with a C. I live in Lenox. I have a question, if I may ask it. Does anybody know what the chemical half-life is of PCBs? And let's take the most heavily chlorinated. Does anybody know that? 1,000 years. That's the half-life.
No, half-life would be less.
Oh, okay. So that's the entire. Okay, thank you.
My name is Barbara Cianfarini, C-I-A-N-F-A-R-I-N-I. I live in Pittsfield, and I'm the acting executive director for Citizens for PCB Removal. And I also would like to thank the EPA for the many, many years of very difficult, complex, and sensitive work that they've done addressing this mega problem. And thank you for sticking to it, not abandoning us, and thank you for listening to us. And by us, I'm including the organizations of HRI, BEAT, Berkshire Environmental Action Team, HEAL, Housatonic Environmental Action League, HVA, Dennis already spoke, BCRPC, Berkshire County Regional Planning Commission, Nate Carnes, and others who have advocated so hard for this river over at least 2 decades of work, and in some cases more than 3 decades. And thank you for incorporating in this plan some of the things we've advocated so hard for, including the fact that you're not proposing any on-site toxic waste dumps, as unfortunately the previous part of the cleanup had, Hill 78 and Hill 71. Thank you for advocating for the use of rail. We do believe it's a lower impact to the community, and in fact, it will be an asset to the community when everything is done, because we believe the rail system will have to be improved and brought up to standards. So then Berkshire County will have that to use afterwards. And we are happy that you are looking to remove it and transport it out. Again, the no dumps. Although we would like to see more use of the adaptive management, which you've also included, to hopefully treat it in situ and not have to have the rail transport or any other kind of transport, which addresses many of the concerns of the abutters to this next process. However, and there's always a however, we echo the concerns of our colleagues who've spoken before us that the 25% proposed removal is nowhere near enough, that 75% left behind is frankly outrageous. If you had any other situation, if you had a cancer to remove, you would not remove 25% of a cancer and leave 75% behind. If you were treating another disease, you would not aim for 25% abatement of that disease. You would be looking for as close to 100% as you could. It's obvious to us that most of the contamination, based on the ppms of 489 ppms, are obviously in the core areas and below the caps. And while no one is advocating for the destruction of the river, it's not a goal, it's not something we want to see. It just has to be done in a way that gets rid of the poison. This is a poison, and we cannot leave it here in any form, in any area where it can expose wildlife and human beings in the future. It just doesn't make sense, as many other people have said. And if it's left in the core areas, it will impact the core areas. It's great that there's rare and endangered species, but why are they endangered? Could they be endangered because they're being exposed to PCBs? There is no doubt in our minds that it will recontaminate the entire system in the future if it's left there in that amount, 75% of the total known contamination. And that's not even accounting for what might be found that wasn't found to date. We believe that more is more, not less is more. And we ask that you go for the full Monty, so to speak. And people have not talked about the cost here too much, and that is a factor. But frankly, the difference between 613 million, is it, and 900 and something million is only a 50% difference. And if you get the 75%, that's 50% for 3 times the value in that last 50% cost. So we believe you should be looking more towards the full cleanup that was proposed, because it's actually bigger bang for everybody's buck, including GE's. And we'd also like to go on record as Citizens for PCB Removal and as a homeowners group to start with. We have gone through the experience of having remediation done on properties, and we know the process, and we know how to advocate for a better process, and we are offering our assistance to any homeowner out there who would like that for themselves. You do have a right to make comments. You do have a right to influence this for the better for yourself. We also appreciate the extended written comment period, or comment period in general, and we will be submitting further written comments as well. And I'd like to say one more thing, and that is that the basis of this being capping, we just don't believe in capping. Caps fail. That's the bottom line. Caps fail. And especially when caps are made out of nothing more than the same material that's in the river. That material moves around. There's really nothing to prevent the cap from moving around. And a prime example of that is the fact that just weeks after the Silver Lake project was finished, to fanfare and ceremony, we had a relatively minor rainstorm for Berkshire County, and the cap of part of Silver Lake failed. I can't think of any better example than that. Caps do not work, cleanup works, removal works, treating it works, getting rid of it works. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim Gray, the Housatonic River Initiative. Tim Gray, Gray, of the Housatonic River Initiative. Probably 5-6 years ago, EPA had GE do the corrective measures study. And in that corrective measures study was some very complete cleanup plans, very strong cleanup plans. Then the state of Massachusetts started meeting with General Electric. And then after that, the state of Massachusetts started meeting with the EPA. Before we knew it, we have a weak cleanup plan. And the cleanup plan is so inadequate that I believe it will leave the river contaminated forever. I don't think the river will have any hope to recover. So I think there needs to be a much stronger cleanup plan. I also want to remind that we have the highest levels in ducks and fish, definitely in the United States and possibly in the world. And it begs to clean up the river for all the critters in the river. I posed a question to the state one time that we have those kind of levels in the fish, and they said, you know, Tim, it's okay because we have stable populations. So I said, so we have stable populations of contaminated fish and ducks. And the first duck that was tested had 3,700 parts per million in it, astounding levels of PCBs. And of course, there was an ecological risk assessment that was done by EPA and GE. I think it lasted about 5 years and cost the taxpayers probably millions and millions of dollars. This was back about 2003, and now it's being ignored. So all that taxpayer money goes down the tubes, and that report was written to make sure that we take care of the critters in the river. As far as capping goes, I'd like to go back to Allendale School in Pittsfield. Allendale School was capped back around 1993, and the people who live in the neighborhood asked that it be monitored. And every 2 years, they tested the cap. And, you know, this is on land. It's not a water-based cap. And every 2 years, it failed. And they had to go back in and fix it and find the spots that were popping up contaminated. Eventually, they excavated the school because the cap did not work. So now we're going to take the cap into the river where there's hurricanes and different things that affect the river, and we expect it to withstand those kind of pressures. So caps, at least at Allendale School, proved that they don't. They just don't work. This thing about no landfill in Berkshire County, the EPA allowed GE to landfill next to Allendale School. And I believe that, well, we know from rumors in the neighborhood that GE is buying land up around the county and getting purchase agreements in place. I don't think they would be doing that if they think they're going to have to, you know, truck it out of the neighborhood. And the other thing is that by landfilling next to Allendale School, there's precedent. So I think they can go before a judge and say, hey, wait a minute. We've done it before. You should allow us to do it again. Adaptive management should be on the table. It should be thorough. It should be slow. It should be incorporate the community into that, not just be something that's decided in Boston. I think that's very important. And my last point is that there's a bigger reason than cleaning the PCBs in the Housatonic River, is that everything on the earth is contaminated with PCBs. Every animal, every human being. The polar bears are getting sick. Orcas are getting sick. Beluga whales are getting sick. Animals in the Housatonic River are getting sick according to the ecological risk assessment. And I think we need to clean up because of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Benno Friedman, Benno Friedman. I'm with the Housatonic River Initiative, founding and current board member. I don't think it makes any sense, nor is it going to convince anyone if I recite more numbers and facts. The numbers and facts, in fact, are very well known, if not discovered by EPA in the surveys and studies that they've conducted. And what we have here is a situation where science is being trumped by politics. Science is being trumped by power. Science is being trumped by forces that are outside of the vision of most of the rest of us, and certainly out of sight from the media. And it shouldn't be any surprise that that's the way things work, because we're looking at the issue of global warming, and in this country, we seem to have a very strong precedent right now for ignoring science. If you went to buy a house, and the house looked beautiful, and its walls were freshly painted, and the carpets were brand new, and the lawns appeared to be healthy, would you buy the house if you knew that you had to live in a house filled with mold that was behind those walls, that was waiting to come out and impact your family at some point? If you went and bought a car, and the car was freshly painted, and it sounded good, but somehow you found out that it was all a fresh coat of paint over a rusted and imperfect and a motor that was about to fail, would you buy that car? We're fortunate in that we don't have to live in the river or the river environment. We live nearby it, but we don't have to live in it. So who's going to advocate for the living creatures that do live in it, if not the Environmental Protection Agency? They're living in the rusted car, the broken down car. They're living in the house filled with mold. And you're proposing to put a fresh coat of paint on the house and on the car. I'm glossing over a little bit. I understand there's work to be done, but to say that you're leaving as much as you have in written form, in detailed written form within the proposed remedy is a crime against the very environment that you're supposed to protect. You have stated for many years that the EPA has the ultimate responsibility and authority to make the decision unilaterally when it comes to environmental groups and all the others that have spent 15 some odd years sitting around the CCC table, listening to information, giving their comments and what have you. Repeatedly we've been told we've had no authority. And yet some authority seems to have occurred somewhere that has the power over you, because you had a very, very strong cleanup a couple of years ago being proposed. And suddenly your authority seems substantially diminished, and the cleanup seems substantially diminished. And we're left wondering, who among the powerful have gotten to you and excised the science and marginalized the decades of work that you yourselves have put into those studies that speak louder than any voices tonight, dictating a required cleanup that goes far beyond what you propose?
I ask you to once again assert your authority and provide us with a beacon of hope in being the Environmental Protection Authority that we hoped you would be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Charlie Cianfarini. Do you remember how to spell it? Same as Barbara. Citizens for PCB Removal. This plan was developed with many considerations and compromises. Unfortunately, these compromises leave 75% of the total contamination of this toxic pollutant. The most intensive plan of those originally considered and proposed was to take longer than 13 years. The longest and most intensive proposal should be the one included in this permit. At a public meeting in Pittsfield, one city official said that PCBs escaped into the river. For the amount of contamination that is in the river, this escape would be the equivalent of all prisoners in the jails of this country to be let out at once. These PCBs did not escape from the GE plant, but were dumped into the river. We expect that GE will litigate any permit. They might as well fight a full cleanup rather than this limited and inadequate proposal. We also need to remember that any PCBs left in the river will eventually become dislodged, recontaminate our communities, and flow down to our friends in Connecticut. It is a gift that I don't want to give them. Thank you.
Thank you. Others wishing to make a statement for the record?
Carl Kronberg, C-A-R-L, K-R-O-N-B-E-R-G. I live in Lanesboro, Massachusetts. Just as a point of reference, I've been a citizen activist for over 40 years, including working for Citizen Action in New York, giving technical support to Love Canal, working on the New Horizons Committee for cleanup of Buffalo River after Bethlehem Steel left Lackawanna, New York, on the committee to suggest economic initiatives to respond to the closing of Louisiana Pacific and Ketchikan, Alaska, a field supervisor for the Department of Commercial Fisheries of Alaska Department of Fish and Game, on the board of Trout Unlimited in Cody, Wyoming, and the State of Wyoming Water Advisory Board, past president of the Taconic chapter of Trout Unlimited, and a member of the committee that initiated the recognition by the state of Massachusetts in the area called the rest of the river designation as an area of environmental concern. First, I would like to compliment the EPA staff for the thorough job they did in the scientific study of the Housatonic River that included the ecology of the river, its history, and of course, its contaminants, in reference to the PCBs dumped in the river and its surrounding environment from 1930 to 1977 by GE. I went to most of the workshops and the more recent series called the charrette. Second, even though it was not within the scope of the study, I would like to suggest that further study be undertaken to identify other contaminants found in the river and the potential health hazards to humans and the environment. Third, any cleanup should clearly express the restoration that would be part of the process and involve the community. Fourth, recently, scientists have become to recognize the positive role rivers have on climate change. While not in the scope of this issue of the importance of the health of the rivers under the Clean Water Act, it should be addressed in plans for river cleanups and any current and future river projects. Fifth, my reaction to the proposal for the rest of the river is not an unexpected disappointment. The science points to a need for much more thorough cleanup of the Housatonic River and its adjacent environment. The scientific analysis should have led to a more thorough cleanup, but I believe it was stymied by the efforts of GE to minimize the cost of the cleanup and by its ability to influence the economic and political culture of Pittsfield and the state of Massachusetts. It may be anecdotal, but individuals have said in public meetings, and to me personally, that they and their families would not go near the Housatonic River until it was cleaned up. I guess my feeling is that all is not lost, because I think eventually future generations will recognize the value that clean river will provide to this community, both economically and as recreational tourism. And they will take pride in doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Brian Burkle, B-E-R-K-E-L. I live over on East New Lenox Road, and I can see the river right from my front yard. I can't see Russia from my back porch, but I can see the river across the way. My biggest concern here at this point as a resident in that neighborhood is just to be able to have a better understanding so that I can be a better participant in this conversation as to what the logistics are going to be for these trucks coming and going from the neighborhood. I'm echoing what Mr. Cook had said in that we just need to know, and we think that we should have that information up front so that we can be a better participant in this conversation. And I think that you guys, I think should owe it to the stakeholders, the property owners, the families who are going to be impacted most over this 5 years or more. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Denny Alsop, A-L-S-O-P. I live in Stockbridge, about 200 yards from the river. And back in 1989, I received the EPA award for canoeing across Massachusetts for rivers, river protection. And I've been involved in river protection since then, a bit. I just came back from Maine, where I started over a period of time at Bar Harbor, and I ascended the Penobscot River to Mount Katahdin, which I climbed. And I thought about the Housatonic the whole way. And then I went across Maine. I went up the west branch of the Penobscot and down Moosehead Lake and up Moose River and eventually to Flagstaff Lake and up the Dead River. And everywhere I went, I saw a river. Most of the land that I traveled through has been changed by man. The landscape of Maine is the landscape of old mills, old dams, old industries which have left, old agricultural and logging practices which have peaked and failed and which have changed the landscape, releasing vast tons of soil from mountainsides down into the river, changing the river, creating wetlands where there were no wetlands, altering the speed of water. And much of this has happened in the last 150 years. I saw change. In my travels on the Housatonic River, I mostly go upstream. When I crossed the state, I had to learn to go upstream. And this gave me a different perception of the river. Where you start at the river, you look down in salt water, through the clear water, at the ground below you, below the water, and what do you see? You see the same pattern. You see the same pattern that you see at the mouth of the Ipswich River, the Connecticut River, the Housatonic River, the Hudson River. It's the same pattern. It's the pattern of energy and water moving, okay? So I'm here to say that I don't think, in my opinion, that you can kill a river. You can alter it, and it will self-correct. It will not do what you want to do, but it will do what it wants to do. It's only a matter of time. 300 yards from my house in Stockbridge, there's the outside bend of the river where the soil gets picked up and carried downstream and redeposited on the inside of the next curve. On the inside of that bend, just specifically, at eye level, were a series of holes in the bank swallows, part of our natural balance between the bugs and everything else. 2 pulses of water in the last year took the first hatch of these birds and swept them away. The birds came back and drilled the holes again, and then they got wiped out again. And now those birds are gone. But they've gone somewhere else. They follow the river. And so do the forms we know as river move. And so do the species of trees and plants and fish and animals move. So I say, let's remember, no matter what we do, we can't kill the river. The river will keep doing what it's going to do. My advice is work with that. Don't get stuck with a fixed idea of what river is. Recognize that it is alive. That's the best thing I can say.
Thank you.
Others wishing to make a comment?
Yes. Oh, sure. You said we might add Peter Defer again. 3 points not been talked about at all. Number one is there's a performance standard for fish tissue concentrations of PCBs. In 15 years, they need to reach below as 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. But 1.5 milligrams per kilogram is many-fold in excess of the recommendations that EPA has for PCBs and fish tissues for human consumption. And in fact, states up and down the East Coast have one of two standards, and that's not in the parts per million, which is milligrams per kilograms, but it's in the parts per billion, and they tend to be either 5 parts per billion or 50 parts per billion. And the 1.5 milligrams per kilogram would be 1,500 parts per billion. That number doesn't protect human health at fish consumption rate, which is considered to be anything more than just minimal. It also won't protect for anybody who already has PCBs in their bodies. The other point I want to raise that hasn't been mentioned except in the very vaguest of terms is Connecticut. Nothing is being done in Connecticut. I've raised this point for over 10 years here, that EPA does not have enough data to write off the state of Connecticut. They need to have insisted on further sampling, and at a minimum, they need to have sediment removed from behind the dams in Connecticut. I hate to see my home state, the waters I grew up swimming in, remain polluted in such a way. And the third point that hasn't been made at all is that this plan would offer probably the most modest PCB remediation of any major contaminated site in the nation. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I have not encountered a PCB contaminated site of this magnitude that has received a proposed cleanup this minimal. It really does stand out in 20 years of experience across the nation, from Seattle to Massachusetts to the Gulf Coast. It's the least. And I don't think it meets EPA's standards. And I don't think it's up to the quality of what the National Remedy Review Board would have expected out of this region. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I don't know how to follow all these elegant speakers. My name is Thelma Barzottini. That's B-A-R-Z-O-T-T-I-N-I. I live in Pittsfield, Mass. I've just said it all before. I just want to thank all the eloquent speakers and the EPA for coming. I just go on record. I don't believe in capping. You can't leave it there. You've got to think about the health to the people and the habitats of the river. And I always say, I know Pittsfield had a consent decree, but I'm quite happy with what happened there. I hope that the rest of the river, they would set up some pilot programs. They would go for the new technology that's out there. I really don't know what else to say. I guess I've said it over and over. I just, the rest of the river, I don't approve of. I never approved of capping at all. I don't think it survives properly, and if you do it in the river with the weather conditions and so forth, and as I say, everybody before me more or less said what I would have said, and I thank you.
Thank you.
My My name's Claire Miller. I'm the Massachusetts State Director for Toxics Action Center. We have office.
Say that again one more time.
Sure. Claire Miller, Toxics Action Center. It's a mouthful. And we have offices in Boston and in Amherst. We're a public health and environmental nonprofit, and we were founded in the 80s after the Woburn Cancer Cluster.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to move a little closer to the microphone. I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Do you want me to, should I speak up?
Speak up.
Okay, great. I want to echo Thelma also saying that it's hard to follow all of these really eloquent speeches, and I haven't had a full chance to dig my way through the permit, so I will be sending more thorough comments before the end of the comment period. Sitting here tonight, though, listening to folks speak from the heart about how they feel about this, I can't help but remember how I came to be a toxics community organizer, which isn't the most straightforward life path. But when I look back on my life, I can't help but notice that I grew up 10 miles from Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant, and it's very clear to me that even at a very young age, I knew that it was there and had some kind of understanding that it could completely destroy my community and my neighborhood and my family. And I don't think there's any better memory that crystallizes what I mean than to share with you when I was about 9 years old. I heard the lighthouse foghorn, but I thought it was the siren for nuclear meltdown, and woke my parents up convinced we had to evacuate. And that's a really strange memory. That's a really strange knowledge for a child to have. And I'm not from the Berkshires. I don't have that kind of connection to the Housatonic River, but I can imagine that families and children have that same kind of knowledge and fear about being contaminated. And so I would urge you all, as you listen to all of these stories and hear the comments, to be as aggressive as possible, remove as many PCBs as possible, because all types of containments, eventually fail, and so we need to be as aggressive as we can the first time around, while we still have as many people as possible involved in the process. And at the end of the day, Toxics Action Center and I believe that we all have the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and live in healthy communities. And so doing the best possible, removing more than just 25%, I think is a major piece of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any others wishing to make a statement before I close the hearing? Hearing none. Thank you all for coming this evening and for your interest in this draft permit. We do have extra copies of the draft permit and the statement of basis available outside by the door. In particular, pages 42 and 43 provide locations where you can review the relevant documents and how to provide EPA with written comments. As we mentioned earlier, the public comment period closes on October 27th, 2014. This closes our public hearing. Thank you.